It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey has had to report back to HQ, it seems. Thanks for joining us from New York.
Well, it's good to be with you on air, and it's good to be here in New York as well.
All right. With us as well, Sylvie Kaufmann, editorial director of the French broadsheet of record Le Monde. Nice to see you.
Good evening. Nice to see you.
Rachel Donadio, Paris correspondent for The Atlantic. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief for the Africa Report.
Greetings.
How are you?
Very well indeed.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. Never did an independence leader weigh so heavily for so long on the fate of his nation. Robert Mugabe passing away this Friday in a Singapore hospital at the age of 95. The schoolteacher turned liberation struggle leader, led Zimbabwe out of white minority rule, and then stayed on, doing whatever it took to hang on to power, crushing dissent in Matabeleland, encouraging the brutal expulsion of white farmers, having the opposition leader beaten, always employing the rhetoric of defiance that earned him the nickname of Comrade Bob.
Journalists, tell those you are representing that the Robert Mugabe is still here, well and strong.
That was less than a year before his vice president chased him finally from power. Patrick Smith, how will you remember Robert Mugabe?
Well, I think it is a very mixed legacy, as you say. I mean, there's no question about his standing as the hero of the liberation war, although he probably didn't ever fire a shot in anger. He was the political leader of one of the leading liberation armies that wrested power from the white settler regime in Rhodesia. So he'll go down in history for that. And he will also go down in history for, perhaps more controversially, for leading the movement for land reform and land redistribution in Zimbabwe. And the reason for that is that it was unfinished business at the time of independence. When they got independence in 1980, there was never any deal over the transfer of land. So the British gave Mugabe flag independence, political independence, but there was no settlement on the economic riches of the state. And at one stage, Zimbabwe was the second or third richest country in Africa, so it was a big prize. Mugabe, for his own reasons, delayed movement on land reform, left it till 2000, and then went about it on steroids, just as the internal dissent and internal opposition to his rule was picking up, and all the economic dysfunction and corruption that had been building up then exploded into this confrontation between the trade union-backed opposition party and Mugabe's own ruling party. And what we saw then is a couple of decades of really fraught politics and economic decline, and that's where the country is today.
Yeah, that sudden spike in tension that we saw in 2000, it led to suspension from the Commonwealth. Mugabe then taking on Tony Blair and quitting the club of former British colonies in 2003.
The British cannot teach us democracy because we taught them democracy here in Zimbabwe through the barrel of the gun.
The British cannot teach us democracy. Do you have, Christopher Dickey, there is this point, especially when you look at neighboring South Africa, a lot of resentment over the fact that all these years after apartheid, so much land is in the hands of so few.
I think that's always going to be a problem when you have a country that's been developed for essentially for colonial purposes, and then you give it independence, and the vast majority of people are not connected to the wealth of the country. That was true. It's been handled to some extent in South Africa. It was certainly true in Zimbabwe, or formerly Rhodesia. And there it was handled in a very radical way that wound up impoverishing everybody in the country, not in fact finding better ways to distribute the wealth. You know, Mugabe is a perfect example of a leader who believes in the myth of his own indispensability, that the country couldn't do without him, and that anything that kept him in power would be good for the nation. Of course, that wasn't true, but it's not a pathology that's unique to him.
And we look, Sylvie Kaufmann, at a man who, again, he dominated politics in his country and perhaps even in the region for so many decades. But we look at him today through our 2019 eyes, and the rhetoric of the Marxist rhetoric, because he was a Maoist, that he employs, it still rings a bell with a lot of people.
Yes, but it's a very sad story, because I'm old enough to remember Zimbabwe's independence, and he was the darling of Europe, of the West at the time. He could have been Zimbabwe's Mandela if he had taken the right turn. But he got, instead he turned that country into a gulag, I mean, killing people, and then this land ownership problem that you pointed out, of course, was inherited from the colonial power, and it was definitely unsettled, not settled when Zimbabwe accessed to independence. But he confiscated the land and gave it to his cronies, and this is really, and you pointed out his Marxist rhetoric that reminded me of Tsiran in Madagascar, who also, I mean, that really illustrates the importance of the personal factor in all those leaders. Tirana, in Malgache it's pronounced Tiran, turned Madagascar, which was a prosperous country, into a miserable country because of his socialist experience in the 70s. And Mugabe did the same, more or less, with Zimbabwe. So I don't know. I mean, whether it rings a bell still today, I don't think so. I think it's a failure of epic proportions.
A failure of epic proportions, and yet tributes pouring in from his successor, but also from South Africa's president, who's issued a statement. We had Cyril Ramaphosa saying, under President Mugabe's leadership, Zimbabwe's sustained a valiant struggle against colonialism and inspired our own struggle against apartheid. Mugabe also fondly remembered by China.
Mr. Mugabe was an outstanding liberation movement leader and statesman who spent his entire life defending his country's independence. He opposed foreign interference and promoted strong ties between China and Zimbabwe and China and Africa.
Your reaction, Rachel Donati?
China has a lot of investments, right?
China has a lot of...
Maybe, Patrick, what's your sense of China's...
Well, I think they're also playing the politics there. Remember when the Nobel Prize was awarded to a Chinese dissident? The next month, China awarded Mugabe the highest accolade of the Chinese state, just to say to the West, hey, we've got our heroes, you've got yours. I think that the Chinese engagement does go right back to the liberation struggle in the old days of the Cold War, when Mugabe allied to the Chinese and Joshua Nkomo from the Matabeleland region allied to the Russians. And the Russians and Chinese were competing for influence in Zimbabwe because the British were beyond the pale. They were seen as supporters of the old settler regime. So there was a grand old sort of battle between the conflicting communist camps in those days. But I would take issue. I've always thought Mugabe was far more Catholic than communist.
Raised by the Jesuits.
His socialism, raised by the Jesuits, devout to the end. His greatest moment, his friends tell me, was that when he met the Pope. And he was, of course, had been endorsed by successive popes, interestingly enough, despite the massive human rights abuses. And those go right back to 83. This idea that Mugabe suddenly became a tyrant when he started taking the land from white farmers is rubbish. He and many of the current regime ran the Gukura Hunde campaign back in 83. 20,000 people were killed in that campaign, which stifled the dissent in that area of Western Zimbabwe. So it's got a long track record. The West said nothing about it then. He became a nuisance when he started interfering with economic ties with the West, and I think that's worth bearing in mind.
All right, and bearing in mind as we look back, Robert Mugabe, who will be buried in his home when his body's recovered, he died in a hospital in Singapore. Over in the UK, he's got a perfect record so far. 3 votes in the House of Commons and 3 defeats for new Prime Minister Boris Johnson. This week, he also lost his overall majority, purged 21 members of his own Conservative Party over the vote, and instead, well, hit the campaign trail, calling the opposition chicken for doubting that he'll keep his word on staging an October 15th general election. October 15th is before the EU's October 31st Brexit deadline.
We want an election on October the 15th. October the 15th.
Can you make a promise today to the British public that you will not go back to Brussels and ask for another delay to Brexit?
Yes.
And, sorry.
I can.
And would you
I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
I'd rather be dead in a ditch. An interesting turn of phrase, Christopher Dickey.
Yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of people in Great Britain who would like to see him in exactly that state. But the problem with Boris Johnson is that everybody in the political world of Great Britain, in fact, most people in Great Britain are probably aware that he has a terrible reputation as a liar. So they see this election ploy as a kind of a deceitful gambit by him to essentially disrupt Parliament. He's already prorogued it. He's already suspended it for 5 weeks. Then you bring people back for an election, but then maybe you push the election date beyond the hard Brexit, no-deal Brexit that he seems to favor, at least as a negotiating strategy. Nobody wants that. Nobody believes him. He has no credibility. But what he is trying to do is recreate the Tory party as the Brexit party. Because if you look at the the European elections of a couple of months ago, the Brexit party of Nigel Farage totally wiped out the Tories. The Tories barely figured in that election. So the last thing he wants to do is to go to a general election and have to deal with the Brexit party. He wants to become the Brexit party.
C.V. Kaufman, we saw during that one vote, there was his leader in the Commons, who's a very hard Brexiter, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who stretched out over 3 seats. Again, it's part of this. Could it in some way, though, be effective? Because it's the idea of Parliament is the establishment, we're the people, in other words.
Well, except that Jacob Rees-Mogg is supposed to be on the side of the people in this story. So I don't know, we've seen so many extraordinary things over the past week. When you think of it, I don't know if you have had time to watch the BBC in the evening, but I couldn't get my eyes off it. It's just such a fascinating, incredible political spectacle, except that it's real life and that it's the fate of a country called Great Britain, which is at stake, and maybe also
and it's
the
selling,
fate of
I see
the European Union. So it's a very serious story, but it's just incredible. I think we're seeing the limits of the representative democratic system, and Boris Johnson is really pushing its limits up to a point where we don't know where it's going to fall, off the cliff. So it's a very serious issue, and I don't know. I mean, maybe one of you around this table knows how we're going to get out of this deadlock and craziness and recklessness, but I have no clue how we're going to find a solution. It's a disaster.
Well, enter Rachel Donadio.
Oh, yeah, I have all those answers. I think it's clear that we are not quite sure how this is going to end. It's like we all kind of are gripped by the BBC and are waiting for the Netflix series so we know how it ends. But I've been struck by how many people in Britain have just kind of given up faith in their politicians. They just think this is ridiculous. They don't believe in them anymore, which reflects situations in other chaotic countries that I've covered, like Italy. But I mean, I've found in the last week or so,
that seems to be part of Boris Johnson's calculation, isn't it? To try to undermine the legitimacy of of those policies.
No, I mean, it is kind of the means of government are somehow undermining representative democracy. I mean, it's kind of, it's very confusing, but I've been struck in the last week in Europe, in France, in the papers here, in Italy, in Germany. I mean, when he made that decision, I can't even use the verb correctly, but there was the sense of the last time parliaments were suspended in the 20th century, that really was not a great moment. And what on earth are you doing? I mean, we all kind of stopped laughing, ha, Boris Johnson and his mop of hair on top, to think this is dangerous.
There is, you mentioned the Netflix series. Patrick Smith, everybody in the UK seems to be bringing this back to his political strategist, Dominic Cummings. And we even know him here in France because there's been this series, Brexit, that's been very popular
on
on
Channel 4 documentary, which is quite an accolade. The brains behind the Leave campaign and all the tricks he was up to. I have to say
played as you can see in these images by Benedict Cumberbatch.
Right. And what people are saying now is that, and maybe it's out of wishful thinking, you don't know, that maybe Cummings thinks he's too clever for his own good, and things have backfired. Because after all, it seemed to be his strategy to prorogue Parliament, simply to shut down debate about Brexit. And then it was his strategy to have the election. And now Parliament has come back and said they don't want the election immediately. So it could well be that he's managed through his own tactical acuity, as he sees it, to have boxed Johnson into a corner. It's very, very difficult to see now because we've had this opposition meeting this afternoon of the so-called sort of rebel alliance, which says, even when you come to us again with this vote on Monday to have a general election for 15th of October, we're not going for it. We want to get our bill through. We want the extension from the European Union for another 3 months till the end of January, and then we'll agree to an election. We'll have that in October or December. October or November. So, that is the replique to what the Brexiters want, and it may well just be successful this time.
Christopher Dickey, just one final word on this advisor. I know in the U.S. where you are, you had, James Carville for Bill Clinton. You've had Roger Ailes for Republican candidates. How does Dominic Cummings rate?
Well, I think Dominic Cummings fits into a mold that we've seen several times in several different countries. I mean, you had Patrick Buisson with Sarkozy in France. You had Steve Bannon with Trump. You've got Dominic Cummings with Boris Johnson and with the Leave campaign, which is really where he made his rep. And you also, to some extent, you have a similar character in terms of Mr. Milne, who advises Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. These are all people who believe that you can push things to the limit, that you need clear definition. They're not middle-of-the-road kind of advisors. They want to cut in a way that you have clearly defined positions and it's us against them. That's common to all of them. And I think it's a very dangerous way of proceeding in a representative democracy. I think that Sylvie's right. I think we really are looking, and not only in Britain, at real problems for representative democracy as advisors like that push the limits of extremism, radicalization, and division.
We're going to have to take a very quick break. When we come back, one final thought on this. What next for the Conservative Party in the UK? Stay with us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey joins us from New York City. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Sylvie Kaufmann, editorial director for French daily newspaper Le Monde. Rachel Donadio, Paris correspondent for The Atlantic, and Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report. Your cover story this week?
Yes, actually coming out in your shops 2 weeks' time, all about Nigeria and the banking scandals. So check it out.
Okay, we'll be following that one
Lots
closely.
of billions at stake.
I noticed, by the way, Sylvie, that Brexit sells. It's made the front page, the top of the fold in Le Monde twice this week.
Only twice, maybe even more than that. Yeah, it's a big story.
The French are captivated.
I think so. I mean, it's important for us too. You know, it's not only because they are going to leave, we suppose, the European Union, and we're very sad for it, and it affects us directly, of course, as the closest neighbor, but also because politically, as we said earlier, it has an impact also on the crisis of democracy that we all share more or less one way or another. If you look at Italy, at Germany, even France, you know, many European countries, yes, are experiencing, you know, troubles with this representative democracy. So we have to watch closely. Of course, we all of us don't have a Boris Johnson, fortunately, I would say.
Not everyone has.
It's interesting, I think, that some of the same tendencies that led to the Brexit vote and the same divides between urban and rural and between the sense of haves and have-nots. We see that in France, there's been the Gilets jaunes movement, and Macron kind of deflected that with the Grand Débat and with responses that kind of prevented a referendum that would try to channel a huge number of other inchoate issues into a yes or no. In Italy, the Gilets jaunes have effectively been governing the country for a while until the past week, and then we'll see. But it is, I think you're right that it's kind of similar tendencies in
the case of the UK, we're talking about the world's longest running parliamentary democracy, with inside of it perhaps the world's oldest running political party, the Conservatives, a big tent until now. They kicked out 21 people who crossed the aisle in Parliament during that first vote. Particularly outspoken, Nicholas Soames. He's the grandson of Winston Churchill. He announced in the chamber that he'll be retiring after 37 years.
I've always believed that the referendum result must be honoured, and indeed I voted for the withdrawal agreement on every occasion it has been presented to the House, which is more than can be said for my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the House and other members of the Cabinet whose serial disloyalty has been such an inspiration to so many of us.
Such an inspiration to all of us. Nicholas Soames, and there's also other grandees like Kenneth Clarke, who's been a member of so many governments, two chancellors of the Exchequer, including Philip Hammond. But when we had a show about this, Patrick Smith, people said, oh, yeah, that's what they are, grandees. It's time to change. Politics, as you heard Christopher Dickey say just before the break, politics now, you have to have it has to be more clear-cut. It has to be more, shall we say, sharpened.
Well, if Boris Johnson represents the sharpened face of British politics, I think we're in for a very bumpy ride. If that's, you've got to remember the Conservative Party is probably the most successful political party in the Western world in the terms of the number of elections it's won, partly because of the weird system we have of first past the post. So there has never been in the last century a majority government in Britain. The minority party has just won by virtue of getting more votes than everyone else. But the Conservative Party have been brilliant at playing that. I think we are seeing a seismic shift, and we're going to see a very large, much more right-wing entity, whether it's called the Conservative Party or the Brexit Party. I don't see much chance of the centrist Conservatives regaining control of the party, whatever happens to Brexit. If they don't get their Brexit and they suffer this seismic defeat, they're going to be very, very bad losers.
But when you count the votes in that eccentric first-past-the-post system that you have, will Boris Johnson's gambit work?
It doesn't look like it, particularly if the opposition coalition holds together and resists his call for an election before the 31st of October deadline, then he'll be regarded as incapable and impotent by his core supporters. And I think the Brexit Party will then go its own way if we have elections in November. And they'll say, well, Johnson couldn't deliver this. Only we can do it as a Brexit party. So you'll get his nightmare, which is the Brexit Party and the Conservative Party in some sort of competition against a solid block of parties that are basically want to stay in the European Union.
All right, so Boris Johnson, who's got tenuous support. He did get support, though, from one out-of-town visitor this week.
Anxious to stand with you and to do everything in our power to strengthen what has been a historic and special relationship.
Christopher Dickey, what do you think of that endorsement?
Well, that was Mike Pence, and I think that Boris Johnson is trying to convince the American people, and Pence is, not the American people, the British people, and Pence is trying to help him with the idea that the United States is going to somehow replace the European Union, that the trade arrangements with the United States will somehow compensate for all the losses that will be accrued by the departure from the European Union. I think the best description of that is probably by Simon Schama, the great British historian, who said that the Americans, in fact, are like a hyena waiting for Britain to die so it can close in and pick it apart.
Sylvie Kaufmann?
Bear in mind...
And so I'm not surprised that Pence is talking about a great special relationship.
Yeah. No, I wanted to... There's a parallel between what Boris Johnson is doing with the Conservative Party and what Donald Trump has done with the Republican Party in the United States. You know, they've turned kind of classic conservative parties into radical populist parties. And the problem also in the additional problem is in England is that the alternative, which is the Labour Party, doesn't look too good either.
All right,
so if you're a British voter, you're in for a bad time. Yeah.
Let's get away from all these radicals, Sylvie. There's something wrong under heaven and earth when moderate Britain goes radical and chaotic Italy disproves its reputation and opts for a moderate compromise coalition government.
We will dedicate our best energies, our abilities, and our passion in making Italy better for all its citizens.
All right, we didn't understand Brexit. We don't understand what's going on in Italy either. Rachel Donati, this isn't the script.
The script, we're writing it as we go along. That was Giuseppe Conte, who's the new prime minister of this incoming center-left government. He was previously the prime minister of the right-wing populist government. And what happened is the main party in parliament, the Five Star Movement, decided now to ally with the center-left Democratic Party after having been in government for 15 months with the right-wing populist League Party. Conte stayed the guy. In Italy, there's a tradition called trasformismo, which means you change depending on the party, but we've rarely seen a prime minister head two completely different governments. So it's quite brilliant. But I have to say that Italy excels at emergencies, but it's even better at kind of responding to those emergencies. So in some ways, this new populist, anti-populist coalition was seen as preventing the far right from coming to
I'll ask the same question I asked to Patrick about the UK. Will it work?
Well, it'll work for now. I mean, for lack of alternatives, in a way. I mean, it's a really good question. The fact is that the largest party in Parliament, which has not been the largest party in the polls, the Five Star Movement, is extremely chameleonic, mercurial. What do they actually believe in? They're kind of left. They're kind of right. They make their decisions through a secret ballot on an online platform run by a private company, which is a huge issue for democracy. But will it work? I think it'll work for now, because what happened, I mean, I can explain if you're interested. I mean, the far right, Matteo Salvini, Interior Minister, after spending 15 months campaigning while in office, decided to pull out of the coalition, hoping for snap elections that he'd win. He didn't expect that the Democratic Party, which had spent years saying we'll never ally with the Five Star Movement, would actually change its mind and ally to block him. So there's a lot of maneuvering. Will it last? Maybe.
All right. You're a former Rome correspondent, Christopher Dickey. Are you keeping score?
Well, I was never a Rome correspondent, but yes, I have been keeping score. I think Salvini is one of the most interesting politicians in Europe, certainly. I also think that Rachel's profile of him in The Atlantic, I think the current issue of The Atlantic, is a brilliant picture of the way he uses social media, the way he campaigns, the sort of Trumpian the campaign rallies he holds, and how effective those have been in Italy. But the key issue for Salvini has been immigration. And there, you know, even as someone who's not at all sympathetic to the populist movements, I have to say the Italians had a lot to complain about with the rest of Europe, because Europe basically was saying, oh, our rules say that the first country they land in, immigrants from North Africa or any place else, that's the country that has to deal with them. And the Italians finally said, no, hell no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to take the brunt of the immigration issue for all of Europe. That's what really enabled Salvini to increase his popularity, first to get into the government as Interior Minister, and then to build his popularity as Interior Minister. Whether the new government under Conte will and the Democratic Party will be able to deal with that issue effectively or convincingly for the Italian people, I think is another question altogether.
I think it's also interesting that to replace Salvini as Interior Minister, they chose a technicrat, so no one, a person who's not a civil servant, who's not a part of either party.
Just very briefly, apparently there's a lot of riling of the fact that the leader of the five-star gets the foreign ministry portfolio.
Yes, he's the one who came to France to meet with the Yellow Vests, even though that kind of went against and caused the biggest diplomatic crisis between France and Italy since the Second World War. The fact is, he is one of the leaders of the largest party in Parliament, so it's not completely unreasonable. But I think Chris is right. Thank you for your plug on my large piece on Salvini, which is Italy, I think, is a really important country to watch. It's always been ahead of the curve, and most of its revolutions have been right-wing. And I think that what Salvini has been able to do and what the current Italian government, or the past until the other day had to do, he weaponized immigration and turned it into a culture clash about values, and he used social media to kind of rile people up in the same way that the Leave campaign in Britain did, and in the same way in some ways that, you know, with the Trump campaign. So the question is, will people still be so angry, or will this government be able to kind of calm things down? And will the fact that he's now in the opposition and doesn't have public funds to run his propaganda machine, will that actually have an impact too?
He still has the social media. And also you have to wonder, you know, this is another example of our twists, strange twists with democracy. You have two parties who win an election last year because people are angry at immigration and they are angry at the European Union. Now, the first government falls down. Second government takes a pro-European turn, you know, sending Gentiloni as a commissioner to Brussels, who is a very good man, but openly pro-European. Choosing a minister for economy who is also very pro-European, a minister for European affairs who also is very pro-European. How is it going to, you know, the voters who voted last year against this agenda, how are they going to take it? And the same with immigration. If this new Minister of Interior takes, you know, a
more lenient stance,
dismantles the decrees that have been taken by Salvini, I mean, you know, how is the ordinary Italian going to react?
Do either side in the coalition have any interest in voting it down, or are they in there for at least a year or so?
I don't know how long. I think the timing is off. It could be that they'll just get a budget bill through and then there'll be elections, but I think they'll stay a little bit longer. The fact is that Italy has a different electoral system than France and than Britain. So what happened was the results of the elections in March of 2018 did not produce a clear majority. The anti-establishment five-star movement came first, the right-wing nativist populist League Party came second, and the Democratic Party came third. So I wrote a story then in The Atlantic that's the people have spoken, but what are they saying? And so the fact is there are a lot of different voices. And I think most people in Italy are concerned that the country has barely grown in 20 years, that their salaries don't go that far, and there's a lot of economic distress too. And I think that the majority of Italians kind of are pro-Europe. I think the fact is that Salvini and the League were playing a kind of double game. He used to say, oh, we want to be out of the euro, which terrified markets and sent Italian borrowing rates up. And now he just says, oh, we want to change Europe from within. So that's pretty chameleonic. I think the fact is that the Italian people are somewhere in the middle. The fact is that their parties don't entirely reflect the people, or they do, but they can't quite come up with a coherent platform.
All right. So the lesson is it's okay to be shouty during the campaign, but but governing's a different story. It's the measure that sparked a summer of protest. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam announcing this week the definitive withdrawal of the extradition bill that would have effectively legalized the sending of political prisoners to mainland China. That was before, though, the crackdown by police and ratcheting up of violence unseen in previous protest movements there.
The Carrie Lam concession, so-called concession, has come too little too late. The damage is done. The scars and wounds are still bleeding in Hong Kong. She thinks that she can use some garden hose to put out a hill fire. That's not going to be acceptable.
But of course, Patrick Smith, we remember 2015 and the umbrella movement, which petered out because, well, they didn't know when to stop, they say themselves. At this point in time, you heard the activists. They say, we have 5 demands, we want them all met.
Yeah.
What happens next?
I just think there's a lot more momentum this time around, and partly it's a question of the timing. I mean, you know, this is 22 years after the handover. They're looking at the clock when the mainland takes full control, and it's the end of the dual system approach. So I think they realize this is the moment. We've got to seize the time. We've got the momentum behind us now, and I think they're going to push. I mean, you know, having refused to withdraw the legislation for three months now, for Carrie Lam to do it at this moment shows a massive weakness. And presumably, like everything else, she's been advised by Beijing to give up this one in the hope of diffusing the protests. I don't think it's going to work. I think the protesters have got the bit between their teeth, and they're going to continue to push.
All right, finally, something to crow about: the fundamental right to good old-fashioned farmyard sounds. When transplanted city slickers tried to silence Maurice the rooster, the French Atlantic Sea island of Oléron was left speechless. Now a court has ruled in favor of the vindicated cockerel. The plaintiffs will have to pay legal fees plus €1,000 damages.
You won your case. Do you realize the fight you won? This is brilliant. And they lost. Yes, my handsome, you're good.
Christopher Dickey, I'm going to ask you to get off the fence here. Are you pro or anti-rooster crowing?
I'm very, very pro-cock there. I think that the rooster was very, very heroic in this, and I think stood up for rural rights in a way that was perfectly appropriate, especially for France. I mean, it's the national symbol, after all.
There is a more serious issue here, which is more and more we're getting these cases. There have been cases, people complaining who've been trying to silence cowbells. There have been court cases about cicadas, trying to have townships eradicate them. What does that tell you about neighborliness?
Is it about freedom of speech?
People believe their peace and quiet comes first. I don't understand. Your thoughts on...
No, but it's the urban-rural divide, and writ large. I mean, it's a wonderful symbol of that.
Patrick Smith, what is it?
It's like saying that we should silence all the cars in the cities.
I'm very pro roosters. I lived in West Africa for 15 years, and every morning in West Africa I was opened up by a rooster, and then I had to wake up, get on with my job as a journalist. So yeah, good. Nice to see them. They should be compulsory in all cities, in my view.
Rachel Donadio?
Let 1,000 roosters crow. I mean, I don't know. I think that Chris is right that it is kind of, I think we're all obsessed with this story because it's a little bit like urban, you know, the city slickers come and say, this is too loud. And then the farmer, like the locals stand up for their rights. Good for them. Let the rooster crow.
Will we see an editorial in Le Monde?
I don't think so. I think we need a First Amendment for roosters.
Well, you joke, but they're actually talking about laws on the books to protect their rights.
But you have to explain me why this story is so fascinating for foreigners.
Everyone loves an animal story after Labor
That's
Day.
True.
Okay. All right. And we do too. Many thanks, Rachel Donadio. I want to thank as well Sylvie Kaufman, Patrick Smith, Christopher Dickey for being with us from New York City. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Nicholas Rushworth.
Hi to you, Francois. Hi, everybody. Of course, they're talking about animals making noises, some leadership issues in Italy. I want to go to one front page from 2016. There we see Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, and Vladimir Putin, the three horsemen of the apocalypse. You had your warnings, Francois, didn't you, in 2016?
Three horsemen. Okay.
Of course, if we scroll down, we can see there what Boris Johnson on the head of Winston Churchill, Trump on Roosevelt, and Putin on Stalin. Of course, Brexit's been a big week for Boris Johnson, hasn't it? One of the front pages of The Sun showed really the topsy-turvy nature of politics at the moment. Here you've got The Sun in London saying, is this the most dangerous chicken in Britain, poking fun at Jeremy Corbyn. And then the Scottish Sun saying, well, Floppy Johnson just can't get anything right, can he? He's got no chance of an election. Okay. So that is ongoing. The Tories have criticised Jeremy Corbyn for chickening out, and this is actually the official tweet from the Tory party. So Bojo's the clown's sense of humour there trickling into the official. Certainly. So that whole question of leadership issues, topsy-turvy politics, very much.
No wonder Le Monde puts this on its front page.
Centre stage in the UK with Brexit. There you can see totally spineless chicken politics. Let's look at Vladimir Putin. What's he been doing? Keeping a quiet time in the Kremlin this afternoon in the last few hours. He's been looking here at Robert Mugabe. Yes, he's got elections going on, so tough times in terms of his support in Russia itself. But there you can see him expressing strong support for Robert Mugabe, died at 95, and the Zimbabwe Mail is saying that Vladimir Putin has been fawning over a brutal dictator in his statement from the Kremlin in the last few hours, saying that Mugabe was central to independence and issuing an elegy really to Mugabe. So the whole question of Bojo the clown, Vladimir Putin being a dictator, a strong man in action, supporting another strong man. And number three in the lot, we've got Donald Trump, who for the whole of this week has been using his Sharpie pen marker to really insist that Alabama is going to be hit by Hurricane Dorian. So rather than dealing with the whole question of the storm itself and its impact on people along the southeastern coast, he's got here saying,
Is this the tone of the campaign to come? Because
Sharpie Gate?
Yeah.
I hope not.
Halloween is coming, so you've got three leaders there, that whole leadership issue. You've got a three-mask pack, 3 in 1, Bojo, Vladimir and Donald Trump, your leaders. And one of my thoughts when I was doing this was you get the leaders you deserve out there. So,
All right. Something to think about. Many thanks, Nicholas Rushworth. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.